Well, there's been a massive debate swirling over the reauthorization of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act court's FISA, which is lauded by its advocates as an essential part to American national security. And unfortunately, this debate fell on deaf ears of most people that constitute the legislature of the United States, particularly the House of Representatives so far, in which most of them actually voted down a provision to amend FISA, the FISA Act, to include an amendment that would prevent the government from being able to potentially look at your data or look at your information without securing a warrant. Indeed, Section 702 of FISA actually allows the government to warrantlessly surveil and look at the contents of people's data who they claim are foreigners. But the problem is, if American data passes through a foreign server, it could also get sucked up under that warrantless surveillance as well. Now, House Speaker Mike Johnson, who is actually one of the people who pushed forth this egregious violation of America's constitutional ethos, and I'll get to that in a second, he said that initially he opposed it. In fact, before he was Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson actually opposed FISA. He opposed warrantless surveillance. But then he said, after a secret briefing with the intelligence community, he changed his mind. Now, I'll let you guys assume what that might mean, especially in the context of the fact that the intelligence community has blackmailed a lot of people in power, and the fact that the intelligence community has a very aggressive lobby, and as Chuck Schumer said, 6 ways from Sunday, of shutting down their dissenters. I won't speculate because that would be intellectually irresponsible of me, but in the context of those revelations, it should be known that support for an intelligence community provision may not be genuine support from a place of virtue and rationalism. It may instead be support that is either coerced or influenced by certain factors that those of us out here in normal land have no control over. But I digress. One of the things that actually struck me was that Mike Johnson and many of the advocates of FISA being able to warrantlessly surveil people is that they say that it is in the name of national security, that national security is the primary reason. Now, before I get into that and I critique that idea, allow me to explain exactly what FISA does. The FISA Act establishes a set of secret courts that the FBI and other agencies can go to under the veil of secrecy without transparency to petition to approve certain things they want to do, including warrantless surveillance. Now, if you believe in the American constitutional ethos that consent of the government and transparency, those two forces should constitute a good political order and are the main requirements for government to remain in existence, then immediately, if you agree with those things, this should at least make you suspicious, and at the very most, it should make you revolt and denounce what is going on, because quite literally, within the government, which is supposed to be transparent, in the name of protecting us, they are violating that core first principle. But more generally, I think the existence of FISA and the general national security apparatus that constitutes a lot of American government is indicative of an error that has been accepted by Americans for decades because it has not been scrutinized with the due that it deserves. The philosopher Hannah Arendt once said in the 1950s, she made an observation, she said in the 1950s, the word national security became the raison d'etat of American governance. What does that mean? It means that that single phrase became the overriding consideration of American governmental policy. Now, this actually is not just Arendt's opinion. There was actually an article published in 1952 that talked about the idea of national security being a vague, ambiguous symbol of power, essentially an empty phrase that means nothing more than what those in power wish for it to mean. Now, this is not really a novel observation, but what is a novel observation that I've actually noticed is that national security as a concept is a subcategory of the idea of national interest. The idea of national interest goes like this. It says that policy in government should be made according to what benefits the nation as a whole. Now, already we have a problem with this concept. In a nation of 330 million people, It is very difficult for any government to corral all of the interests of the different groups, ideologies, and cultures within that nation, and then try to subsume them into one policy. This is the fundamental problem of pluralism, which, by the way, I support pluralism. Pluralism is the best, I think, especially most American way for us to conduct society, because we don't exist on the basis of some racial lineage or some familial bondage. We exist rather on the basis of coming together in a voluntary context, using our spiritual qualities, i.e. our values, to give consent to this thing we call the government, and then from that, protect us in course of living in society. So pluralism is the best possible way for all these cultures to exist by affirming these spiritual values. But having said that, there are difficulties. And so the problem of a national interest is actually going to pose a lot of difficulties with that project. But then additionally, when you begin to question what the idea of a national interest presupposes, you may find several errors that you did not consider or see before. Number one, the first error of this idea of the national interest, which has given rise to the empty phrase of national security, is that it presumes that all other interests within the nation should be subordinate to the good of the nation, including the interest of individuals or smaller groups in society. The immediate problem with this is the problem that of all political concepts that happen to appeal to an abstract group-based thinking narrative. How can you establish what the national interest is without appealing to a greater standard? Now, the national interest is not this only concept that does this. You may have heard the term the common good, or the good of society, or the good of the whole, or the greater good. Well, the national interest is simply a variation of this abstract group-based thinking that appeals to this concept by itself without constraining the concept with a standard. Because if the standard of what is good is what the group thinks, then that standard is locked within the context of the group. You have no higher justification because the group itself becomes the moral arbiter. This is the problem of democracy. The problem of democracy is that you have this group that happens to get power and it sets the moral standards without having to justify their arguments outside of the self. And if you cannot justify your arguments outside of themselves, we say that you are committing the fallacy of circular reasoning. Well, national interest is basically the fallacy of circular reasoning because it cannot justify itself outside of itself. And this is one of the reasons why I think American pluralistic individualism is the antidote to the group-based thinking that has constituted the great majority of world politics up until this 18th century, the 1700s, when America finally came into the world, birthed through the incandescent burning of energy by great men who understood under what conditions do human beings actually flourish. People who seek to justify the ideology of national security, because really it's just an ideology, it's not a goal to aspire to, it is an ideology, fail to escape this circular nature of their arguments because the telos of their project, the final end of their project, seems to be for the good of the nation without defining what the good of the nation actually means beyond national security. If the good of the nation, if we take that idea seriously for a second, as the 18th century natural law theorists did, and we describe the common good not as what most people in a particular group agree with, but instead what particular thing universally benefits humanity, then we can say that we have to work from a context of first principles and natural rights. Because the entire idea of natural law and first principles is that there are just certain ideas and things that are built into the nature of both the world and humanity that are universal throughout cultures, and they enable human flourishing, they enable a moral society. So the American political context actually already accounts for this, because America is built upon a very, 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 very strong foundation of natural rights. So the common good in this particular case would not be what the community thinks is good, but instead what is good according to what we find out through reason provided to us by natural law. That means protecting my property, fulfilling my contracts, pursuing justice under those ideas, things of that sort. That is the common good. And when John Locke referenced the common good in his second treatise of the government, he was talking about that particular narrow, limited moral formulation. But instead of looking towards that, which, by the way, if we look towards that, we would then see that the national security ideology and the idea of the national interest violates natural law and natural rights every single time, because it attacks one of the core foundational rights of Americans in their society, which is the fundamental right to be uninhibited in their freedom, which presupposes the right to privacy. If you cannot be private in your moral doings, in your doings that are not illicit, that are moral, that are permitted under a natural law framework, then you cannot be free. Because if you cannot be private, your behavior will be subject to some external force that can then, if they decide to, seek to suppress your behavior or corral your behavior towards a certain end, a certain telos. What do you think China does? What do you think the social credit system is? It is precisely this. It is the absence of the right to privacy, or rather the absence of recognizing the right to privacy, which then infringes upon my ability to act as a moral agent beyond what the society I live in wants me to do. It's concerning. And it is precisely what the idea of American national security presupposes. But there's a second problem. And this is a problem that's actually revealed to us by public choice economics. How can you expect people in power to act towards this mythical good of the nation when people in power, as public choice economics shows us, are guided first and foremost by their own self-interest? This is the entire idea that Jefferson said. If men could be angels, government would not be necessary. That's the entire idea. What's part of that, what the idea presupposes, is that there's a vice within all of us as human beings that move us towards lower kinds of action. And no amount of force is going to be able to push us towards virtue, but force is going to be able and is needed to keep those who do not want to do virtue from harming your life. But when those people are in power, what does that then entail? It entails the people that are supposed to do good are actually in a spot to do bad. That's why I always say on this channel that the norms of power will corrupt your social agenda. The norms of power make your good intentions void. The norms of power may say, well, let's go ahead and let's raise the minimum wage. But the norms of power, despite your good intentions in trying to help people who may be working minimum wage jobs in your own mind, cannot dispute the fact that the more something costs, the less producers will want of it, and then therefore the laws of economization set in and actually harm those people. But the norms of power say the people want X, I want X to ensure I can keep a hold of power, therefore let me provide X, even if that does the exact opposite, because the norms of power are separated from the laws of reality insofar as they're not a consideration. Reason is not a consideration of power. Preservation of power is. In a national security context, where the government can go in and warrantlessly surveil you, the government can go in and do all kinds of things that violate your right to privacy, how in the world can you assure that it's for the good of the nation? Mike Johnson, how can you do that? You can't. You absolutely cannot. There's no possible way to do it beyond faith in your leaders. And over the past few years, my friends, I'm not sure about you, but Christian Watson hasn't had much faith in his 23 years on this earth. 7 or 8 or 10 of which, rather, I've been politically conscious, maybe 11 of which. I haven't had much faith in my government. And the more I learn, the more philosophy I study, the more I drink from the well springs of the founding that give me a lot of my ideas, the more I read critical accounts of government in the 16th and 17th century, the more I disdain government. Not because I don't think it's necessary. I believe that it absolutely is necessary. But because I understand that men who are governed by power, men who are governed by their own greed and their own lust for growth in a way that is destructive to society, will do things in the name of the good that are fundamentally not good. And the ideologues who construct these political ideas of the common good or the greater good quite literally give those bad people license to do what they want. Almost every authoritarian in the past 70, 80 years, whether it be Castro, whether it be the guy in Germany, I won't say his name, whether it be Stalin, whether it be Mussolini, appealed to the greater good appealed to this broader concept, not just as a political strategy, but as a means of inspiring this pseudo-religious sentiment within the hearts of man to drive them towards conclusions that were fundamentally not only harmful, but they were against their moral duties to their fellow man, they were against natural law, and they ended up making their societies terrible. And yet, Mike Johnson will sit there and tell you, we're doing this for national security. How do you ensure those who are in those positions of power will actually secure us? There's a complication. Number 3, and the last point I think that is very important to make here. If we accept the reality that it is impractical for people to be entrusted with authority to execute the national interest, so-called, in terms of national security, this brings to rise another separate question. Who are the people in power securing the country from? Its enemies? How is that particularly defined? Is that defined in a self-interested way that will help those in power preserve their grip on authority? If there is no overarching standard of what the national interest actually means, or ground it in objective truth, ground it in a rational foundation, ground it in a universalist morality, then my friends, there is no possible way you can secure anything and be sure you are actually defending your nation from threats. Security will only be defined in terms of what those who occupy the halls of power define it as. They will tell you that Edward Snowden is somehow a danger because he leaked secrets, even though, under the framework of consent of the governed, those secrets really shouldn't be secrets whatsoever, especially if they concern how the government is treating their own citizens in a way that does not give them informed consent that they can take into the ballot box, or they can take into their local councils or the congressmen to reject to. That sounds to me like secrecy and evil happening under the veil of secrecy. And yet, for fulfilling the basic birthright of 1776 Americanism, for fulfilling the basic duty of all of us, to consent to the power used in our nation, Snowden is seen as evil. Julian Assange is called a treasonous person. And there are people that are calling for him to die. Now, as of the posting of this video, thankfully, Biden is considering dropping charges against him. But I'm not confident, because Biden is way within this system. He's not going to do it. I'm not confident, but that's a different day. All because Julian Assange's offense was against the government in preservation of transparency. And we all understand that the pursuit of justice and preservation of something good and preservation of those first principles is not a vice, it's a virtue, no matter what the people in power say. The term national security, my friends, it presumes a morality of power. This is my last point before I close. And this morality of power says, what those who are designed to protect us, ostensibly, say is good for us, must be good for us. And those that go against that are traitors, they are treasonous, and they cannot be allowed in the nation. But what if I told you that power does not dictate morality, because power and morality are two different categories. They're two different sources. Power is what is brought forth by consideration of moral behaviors, or immoral behaviors rather, that could happen in its absence. Power is what is brought forth to safeguard the individual in their furtherance of their own moral behaviors in the society. To say that power, or to assume by saying that those that go against certain things are against national security and therefore they are traitors, assumes that power itself is the arbiter of morality, and that there is no morality, really, that exists outside of power. Now, some folks may say, Christian, you're just strawmanning. No, I'm taking the idea to its logical conclusion. Because if you can reject the basis of small Republican virtuous government, which is based on transparency, based on popular sovereignty, based on consent, rather, well, not based on consent, but it is furthered by consent, then how can you pose any other moral framework for that kind of government without, in some way, eroding that kind of government? You can't. This morality of power needs to go. This pseudo-Nietzschean morality of power, that those who occupy the national security industry in America, it needs to go. Because if it doesn't go, we will continue our downward spiral into an America that wears a skin suit of its former self, that has operatively no constitution, that has operatively no respect for rights, that has operatively no respect for its first principles, and instead respects one and only, well, two things primarily: how money moves and how those in power move the money. That's not an America that I want, but we are slipping down this. FISA is just one leg on the stool of national security ideology that is stripping America of its fundamental ethos, and that is a rebellion against 1776 Americanism, one of the greatest domestic rebellions ever conceived in this country, perhaps second to the administrative state, which is a different video, different day. I will leave you with the word of Samuel Adams. Samuel Adams, that great prophet of Americanism, he said himself that if our country were to fail, my friends, if it were to be torn apart, a foreign adversary wouldn't do it. A domestic adversary would do it. Everyone who supports FISA and the reauthorization of Section 702 is aiding and abetting the domestic adversary that seeks to destroy our country, and should therefore lose their positions of power and have to answer to their voters and answer to Americans, in my opinion, why they should keep their citizenship and not be deported to a country that better fits their view of how the government should operate in accordance with their citizenry. Take that for a radical perspective. My friends, like, comment, share, subscribe, do whatever you can. Let us get this channel up. If you enjoy social and political commentary with a philosophical bent, I must also encourage you to share this, help me get the message out there. My friends, study history, study philosophy, remain morally convicted, reject FISA, reject the NSA, reject all that stuff. Embrace Americanism, embrace natural law, embrace philosophy, and please, stay pensive. Bye, guys.